But what about the many other characters from the past, the present, and the future? Let's start with Scrooge's partner, Jacob Marley, who, as is established at the beginning of the story, is dead. Despite this setback, he appears to Scrooge and informs him that he must change his ways or be forced to suffer Marley's fate of walking the earth but being unable to interact with it. And one pretty consistent pattern with the movie portrayals of this character is that they lack a certain... subtlety. I don't know what it is about this character, but for some reason almost everyone who plays him feels the need to play up the ghost aspect of the character to ridiculous proportions. I mean, I half expect the guy to jump out and yell, "Boogity boogity!" The one version that does show some subtlety, though, is the Patrick Stewart version. This depiction of the character still acts like a tortured ghost, but he also acts like Jacob Marley. And because of that, Scrooge is able to make a connection with him and is more receptive to what he has to say. Of all things, I actually think the Muppet version does this really well, too. Instead of just Jacob Marley, we have the Marley brothers, Jacob and Robert, portrayed by Statler and Waldorf, the two old men who usually heckle the Muppets from their box. I like this depiction because, again, despite the fact that they're ghosts, they still act the same way that they did in life.
We were always heckling you!
It's good to be heckling again.
It's good to be doing anything again!
There's also something a little bit sad about it, as we see that despite their suffering after life, they still haven't really changed, almost as if they have no recourse but to behave the way they did in life forever. But by and large, Marley's far more subtle in the book. But let's take a look at the living characters. Most prominently, we have Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's beleaguered clerk, working for Scrooge for the paltry amount that Scrooge is willing to pay him in order to support his wife and family. And one thing I noticed about the various depictions of Bob Cratchit is that they all look a little bit too healthy to be somebody living in poverty. The Patrick Stewart one is really the only Cratchit I've seen who actually looks like he's wasting away. Well, that and Kermit, but then he's a frog. But physical issues aside, I really do like the depictions of this character that I've seen in the movies. As far as the rest of the family goes, the individual depictions are usually pretty good, and the Mrs. Cratchits especially are usually able to pull off a pretty compelling performance. But it's seeing the whole family together that almost always moves me in every movie that I've seen. Seeing this family taking such joy in celebrating Christmas together, even though they have so little, is always incredibly touching. And seeing their reaction to Tiny Tim's death almost always makes me a little teary-eyed. Watching the various actors playing Bob Cratchit trying to hold it together and keep a brave face, but ultimately not being able to, is just heart-wrenching. Even when the family is made up of pigs and frogs, they still manage to elicit an emotional response.
I am sure we shall never forget Tiny Tim, or this first parting that there was among us.
And actually, I think the best version of this family is in the Robert Zemeckis animated version, which shows us the little bits of doubt and the optimism of Mr. and Mrs. Cratchit that they try to hide from their kids. I think it's a very realistic depiction of a family falling on hard times and yet trying so hard to celebrate Christmas. Nephew Fred is also a lot of fun in the movies, always being so boundlessly optimistic in his relationship with his uncle. I actually like Colin Firth's almost angry depiction of the character in the animated version. But my favorite is Roger Rees in the George C. Scott version. I love the bumblingly happy portrayal of this character, and of course, no one does it better. And the characters of the past, like the past itself, are allowed more time and more definition in the movies. Especially the Alastair Sim version, which looks both at Fezziwig's business philosophies and Belle, Alice in this version, and her life after leaving Scrooge. Just like with Scrooge, each actor brings something new to the characters, and each writer does everything to add a new layer of dimension while still staying true to the original story. So now let's look at the descriptive style of Charles Dickens versus the movie magic of, well, the movies. Alright, I'll be perfectly honest here, even though it means losing some of my literature cred, but this is the first Dickens I've read. I know, it's disgraceful, but it's true. And it's not like I've been actively avoiding him, I just never really got around to it. And while I will admit that yes, some of his prose can be pretty long-winded, this guy really knows his way around a sentence. There's something almost poetic about the way he writes. The descriptions, the metaphors, the cadence. This guy is definitely a storyteller, and it's really easy to get wrapped up in the words that Dickens wrote. A Christmas Carol especially seems to be one of those stories that was meant to be read aloud, simply so you can get the full scope of the words. Which may actually explain why so many people have felt compelled to make visual adaptations of this story and why they've been so effective at it. This is a visual story. I think from a visual standpoint, the animated Zemeckis version is probably the best. They're able to do so much with the animation, and even though I know a lot of it's there just for the sake of showing off the 3D, it's still really effective and creative. I especially love the designs of the three ghosts in this movie. The flame on the Ghost of Christmas Past is an inspired idea, and I like how the Ghost of Christmas Present actually ages throughout the day, something that always bothered me a little bit in the other versions. But by far my favorite is the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, who is nothing more than a shadow. That is just brilliant. Unfortunately, this is a Disney film, so every nice subtle moment is almost immediately followed by a moment that's not. But to be fair, Disney is not the only culprit. The music in the George C. Scott version is so bombastic it sounds like a melodrama. It's like they're saying, no, Scott's acting isn't enough, we need to make it obvious that this is a dramatic moment! And the other versions have similar problems, especially during the Marley scene and in the future. And I think the problem is that the spookiness of these scenes is very much reliant on the text that Dickens wrote. I mean, think about it. Dickens spends the first 3 or 4 paragraphs of the book establishing very firmly that Marley is dead, which is what makes that scene so spooky. A lot of movies have narration, but it isn't nearly as effective, and so the movie makers feel the need to turn their movie into a horror flick. And once again, I feel like the Muppet movie handles these scenes the best. Yes, the version of the story told with puppets is actually the one that has the most subtlety. Now that's not to say that there aren't some things with the imagery of the movies that are really well done, but Dickens' descriptions are just so incredibly vivid and so brilliantly worded that the imagery of the movies just doesn't compare. I mean, come on. It is Dickens. Now, originally we were going to do the ghosts as one category, but after some consideration we decided that it's the depictions of the past, the present, and the future that really make this story, so they each get their own round. So let's get started by taking a look at the past. The Ghost of Christmas Past is probably the ghost that has had the most varied interpretations. Think about it, the ghosts of Christmas Present and Future look pretty much universally the same, but the past is always different. This is probably because the book's description of the character is pretty ambiguous, probably to demonstrate that the past has many faces. So the Alastair Sim version depicts the ghost as an old man, while the George C. Scott has a woman, the Muppet version has a little girl, and the Patrick Stewart version has, well, Joel Grey. I think the animated Zemeckis film has probably the best design, with the flame for a head and the shifting faces at the end. Certainly it's the closest to the book's description, and given the fact that he's holding a cap that looks like something you'd use to snuff out a candle flame, it makes sense that his head would be a candle flame. His personality, on the other hand, well, that's another story. The actor decided to play up the fact that this was a ghost by speaking in a wispy ghost voice, which got really annoying really fast. The other ghosts were okay as far as their personality was concerned, but they don't quite match the description of the book. The ghost is described as shifting between forms, sometimes looking like a little girl, sometimes an old man, sometimes a woman, and sometimes something not of this world. Again, illustrating that the past has many faces, and it's unfortunate that the ghost that matched this most closely, at least from a design perspective, had the most annoying personality. But we also have to look at the depiction of the past itself, and as we've already said, the movies always delve deeper. I especially loved watching the Alastair Sim version, watching Scrooge slowly lose everything about himself and become the cold-hearted man that he is in the present. I also like that Marley does try to warn Scrooge on his deathbed that they were wrong in the acts that they committed during their lives. And I really like the scene with Cratchit that echoes the scene that everybody recognizes from the beginning of the story. Like this asking for a day off on Christmas Day is a long-standing tradition of sorts.
Every Christmas you say the same thing. And every Christmas it's just as inconvenient as it was the Christmas before. Good night.
Dickens simply didn't focus on the past as much in the book, and I appreciate that the movies, almost without fail, go further into depth.